They said the bishop died peacefully, yet his final diary ended mid-sentence. Hidden beneath the altar of St. Mary's, there was a chamber no map acknowledged. It was not built for prayer, nor for silence. The record was sealed, not to protect the faithful, but to protect them from knowing. The camera lingers on the cathedral, gray stone washed pale by morning light, a silence that feels almost too still. St. Mary's Cathedral, rising out of the old quarter, like a relic pulled from another century, its spires chipped, its bells tarnished, the windows clouded with soot and weather. It had stood for 400 years, unbroken, unshaken, unmoved. But on that last Sunday, something in its rhythm faltered. Something in its heart began to fail, because that morning, its bishop could not rise from his chair. Bishop Alden Merrow had served here longer than most parishioners had been alive. To the city, he was a fixture, the bent man with pale hands, who still carried himself with the dignity of a figure carved in marble. People spoke of his voice, low and clear, that could make even the most ordinary prayer sound like a plea torn from the earth. He had led weddings, funerals, confirmations, confessions. His presence had been steady, predictable. But as dawn broke that day, the bishop's gait was uneven. His steps trembled on the stones. The acolytes who carried the missals noticed the way his hands shook as he blessed them. They thought it was age, fatigue, nothing more. But something wasn't right. By the time the parish filled the nave, the bishop had grown pale. His vestments hung awkwardly on his frame, like fabric on a man already half departed. When the choir began its processional hymn, he closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they said there was something in his gaze that unsettled. A few in the pews whispered about it afterward, how his eyes seemed to skin not the congregation, but the walls, the rafters, the ground itself, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. He moved slowly to the pulpit. His hand lingered on the rail, as though it steadied him against a great weight. The cathedral, with its high vaults and echoing choir, always magnified his words. But that morning it betrayed him. His voice cracked. His sermon was not a sermon, not in the way the faithful expected. At first, his words were no louder than whispers. The microphone caught them only in fragments. Not stone, not what we built. Older than this, the congregation leaned forward, straining. Some smiled nervously, mistaking it for a slip of memory. Others frowned. His words came in broken rhythm, as though he were piecing them together from scraps remembered in haste. He spoke of the cathedral's foundation, how it was laid deeper than the city's records could show. He mentioned charters lost, maps altered, burials forgotten, and then he said it. That which we kneel upon was never meant to hold light. The words hung in the air like smoke. The organist's hands faltered. A silence rippled through the nave. For a moment, it was only his breath against the microphone, uneven, rasping. He looked at them, truly looked at them, and those who sat closest swore his lips trembled not from weakness, but from restraint. As though he were keeping back something he dared not say aloud. But then he pressed forward. They told us it was ground consecrated. They told us it was sanctified. But there are things buried deeper than stone, and they are not ours to bless. A mother drew her child closer. An old man folded his hat nervously in his lap. Somewhere in the back, someone coughed just to break the silence. The bishop closed his eyes, and that's when he heard it, a sound that no one else claimed to notice. His head tilted sharply, as though struck by a voice from beneath the floor. He froze, every muscle rigid, one hand tightening around the pulpit until his knuckles whitened. His mouth moved, but no words came, only breath, only the faintest echo of something like prayer. Acolytes shifted uncomfortably. The deacon whispered his name, Bishop, but Alden Merrow didn't answer. He spoke again, but not to them. We were never the first. It was then that fear rippled through the congregation. The kind of fear that doesn't rise from sudden terror, but from the slow realization that what you're hearing should not be said, that the one who had always been a guardian of peace was now drawing back a curtain no one asked to see behind. He stepped down from the pulpit, not gracefully. His foot caught the step, and for a moment he nearly collapsed. 2 men in the front row rose to help, but he waved them off. He staggered to the altar. He placed both hands upon it, Bowing his head so low his forehead touched the stone, he whispered something there. So quietly, even a microphone could not catch it. Some swore later they heard him say, "Forgive me." Others claimed it was "Remember me," and then silence. The bishop did not rise. The congregation shifted. Some thought it was prayer. Others thought it was collapse. And when at last 2 acolytes rushed forward, they found his lips still moving, his eyes wide open, staring at the altar as though it were not stone, but a window. They carried him out through the side door, his vestments dragging along the marble, his body frail in their arms. Whispers filled the cathedral. What had he meant? What did he hear? For days afterward, parishioners replayed those words in their minds, not ours to bless. They muttered them over coffee, over market stalls, in hushed tones at funerals and baptisms. Even those who had not been present claimed to have heard it. The bishop never returned to the pulpit. Within the week, he was confined to his quarters. His health faltered. His breathing grew shallow. And though the city doctor insisted it was age, the attendants whispered otherwise. They said he woke at night, sat upright in bed, listening, always listening, to the ground. And sometimes he whispered back. But that was not the end, because before he died, he asked for one last thing. Not confession, not communion, not the company of family or fellow clergy. He asked for silence. 3 nights before his death, he ordered the bells stilled, ordered the choir disbanded. Even the prayers of the sisters were hushed. No sound was to rise within the cathedral walls. And in that silence, attendants claimed he wept. No one ever heard his voice in sermon again. His final words, if they were words at all, were spoken in a whisper too faint for any ear but his own. But they said that on his very last day, as the candlelight guttered low, the bishop turned his face to the wall beside his bed. He pressed his hand to the stone, and he smiled not in peace but in recognition. And then he was gone. The city mourned. They buried him beneath the cathedral floor, as had been tradition for centuries. But even as the coffin was lowered, there were those who shifted uneasily, who could not forget the last sermon, who wondered why his voice had faltered, why his gaze had strayed, why his hand lingered always on the stone, and why he had asked for silence. Because silence, they said, is not absence, it is listening, and once you begin listening, it is very difficult to stop. The bishop was gone, but unease remained. It lingered in the pews, in the cold stones of the crypt, in the air of every Sunday service that followed. Parishioners swore the place felt different, not visibly changed, not corrupted, but listening, like the cathedral itself had heard the bishop's last words and had chosen not to forget them. And when the next Mass was held, the congregation sang, but their voices did not rise with the same warmth. They fell flat, as though the walls swallowed them before they could reach the rafters. Some said it was grief. Others said it was something else, something that had been awakened and buried deeper than stone. The camera drifts across the cathedral's archives, dust settling on shelves that stretch into shadow. Paper, leather, the weight of centuries pressed into silence. After the bishop's death, the church entered a season of rearrangement. Rooms were cleared, records tallied, his belongings divided and stored. The archivist worked slowly, carefully, guided by the rhythm of preservation. To them, each book was a fragment of history, each page a reminder of the endurance of the institution. But even in the safety of catalog order, mistakes surface. And sometimes what surfaces was never meant to be seen. One afternoon, in the second week of sorting, a clerk named Daniel Ferris pulled a box from the cathedral's south wall, a box misfiled, stacked beneath 3 volumes of hymns no one had touched in years. Its lid was swollen with age, its corners warped. Inside, beneath receipts, donations, and brittle copies of correspondence, he found something strange, a folded sheet, thicker than paper, heavier than parchment, its edges yellowed, its folds sharp as though it had been hidden for a purpose. Daniel spread it across the oak table. He thought it was a map at first, then a floor plan. The ink was faded but legible, lines, grids, circles. And then the recognition struck him. It was the foundation of St. Mary's. The cathedral itself, sketched in skeletal outline, each wall traced, each column noted, the crypts beneath marked in careful pen. He had seen such drawings before, tucked among architectural records, kept for restorations. But this one did not match, because beneath the familiar crypt, below the sacristy, below the chancel, were additional chambers, long corridors, intersecting vaults, compartments that did not appear on any official record. The blueprint was not a record of what had been built. It was a record of something hidden. Daniel frowned, his pen stilled above the register. He leaned closer. In the margins, cramped and faint, were notes, not the measured hand of an architect, but hurried scrawl, not to be opened until the trumpets fall. He read it twice, then a third time. The phrase coiled in his mind like a riddle. He glanced at the door, half expecting someone to enter, to laugh, to explain it away. But the archive remained empty. The sound of his own breath was the only company. For the rest of the afternoon, Daniel worked in silence. His thoughts circled back, always back. Trumpets, fall, not to be opened. That night, he told the head archivist, a man named Caro. Caro dismissed it, said such sketches were common. Drafts altered, projects abandoned. He waved his hand as though brushing away a cobweb. But when Daniel left the room, Caro opened a drawer, removed the sketch, and studied it in the dim light of his lamp. And Caro did not dismiss it so quickly, because he had worked the archives for 40 years. He had seen restorations, alterations, repairs. And never once had he seen such chambers listed, not in blueprints, not in ledgers, not in oral record. He traced the faint lines with his fingertip. His hand paused at the scrawled note, not to be opened until the trumpets fall. But something wasn't right. The ink of the handwriting was darker than the rest, fresher, as though the margins had been added later, perhaps decades, perhaps even centuries. He leaned closer, and for a moment thought he could see the impression of the pen still pressed into the paper, as if the hand that wrote it had leaned hard, desperate, fearful. Caro folded the page again, too carefully. He returned it to the box, but not the shelf. Instead, he locked it in his private cabinet, and he said nothing. For weeks it remained there, folded and hidden. But silence, like stone, does not erase unease. Others began to notice. The archivist whispered of Caro's strange behavior, how he lingered in the south wing long after hours, how he checked the locks twice, 3 times, how he avoided speaking of the bishop or the crypt. Daniel, restless with curiosity, confronted him, but Caro dismissed him again. Blueprints mean nothing without builders. Let it go. His voice was sharp, too sharp, the kind of tone that reveals fear beneath denial. But Daniel did not let it go. Late one night, when the archives emptied and the lamps burned low, he took the keys. His hands shook as he turned the lock. Inside the cabinet, beneath layers of correspondence, he found a folded sheet. He carried it to the desk, unfolded it again, stared at the lines until they blurred. The chambers were there, unmistakable. Long halls, marked with small crosses. A central vault with no entrance drawn. Notes written beside it in that same frantic hand. Not to be opened, not be disturbed, until the trumpets fall. And Daniel wondered, were these warnings or instructions? The thought settled heavy in his chest. He laid the sketch flat, closed his eyes, tried to recall every sermon the bishop had ever spoken, every phrase that lingered, and his mind returned again and again to that last day. There are things buried deeper than stone. It was then he felt it, the faintest vibration through the oak of the table. A carriage passing, a draft shifting. He pressed his palm flat against the paper, and that's when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, more suggestion. The way silence can sometimes thrum if you listen too closely. A low impression, like breath in the hollow of a wall. Daniel jerked his hand away. The blueprint fluttered as though stirred by wind, though no window was open. He folded it quickly, locked it back into the drawer, and he left the archives without looking back. But unease had already spread. Others began speaking of it. The archivists, the clergy, Even a few parishioners who had no reason to know. Word traveled in fragments. Whispers of a map of hidden chambers. People asked questions no one could answer. And though the cathedral stood silent, each Sunday more and more eyes drifted toward the floor, toward the stone beneath their knees. Caro died the following winter. A sudden stroke, they said. His belongings were sorted quickly, unceremoniously, the cabinet unlocked, the papers divided, and once again the blueprint found its way into circulation, passed between hands, studied in secret, always returned, always refolded, because no one wished to be the one to keep it. The drawing was no longer a record. It had become a burden. Even those who had never seen it swore they could picture it perfectly. The corridors, the vaults, the warnings, not to be opened until the trumpets fall. The phrase passed from mouth to mouth, twisted, repeated, half in jest, half in dread. And the more it was spoken, the more it changed the air around the cathedral. Prayers grew shorter. Hymns faltered. People glanced at the floor with suspicion, as if beneath their very feet something waited, something closed, something sealed, something promised to open. The blueprint remained, folded, hidden, feared, but the words written in its margins continued to echo, soft and persistent, not to be opened until the trumpets fall. And no one knew what would happen if the trumpets ever did. The camera moved slowly across the sacristy. Wooden cupboards, brass candlesticks dulled by smoke, vestments folded and hanging like abandoned skins. At first glance, it was an ordinary room, narrow, quiet, a place where priests prepared themselves before stepping into light. But beneath the silence, there was something unsettled, a heaviness in the air, as if the stones remembered more than they were willing to show. For years, caretakers had whispered of an odd seam along the far wall, a place where plaster cracked differently, where the stone seemed newer than the rest. Most dismissed it. Renovations had scarred the cathedral many times. But one man could not let it go. His name was Malcolm Gray. He had served as caretaker for 30 years. He swept the aisles, lit the candles, carried the keys to every door. He knew the sound of each hinge, the smell of each draft, and he knew that wall. He had passed it thousands of times, always feeling the faintest draw, as though something behind it wanted him to notice. On a damp evening in late spring, he decided to act. The cathedral was empty, the bells still, candles guttered low. Malcolm locked the sacristy door behind him. He set his lamp on the floor, and he touched the wall. The plaster crumbled beneath his fingertips. His breath caught. He pressed harder. A section gave way, powdering the floor with fine dust. Not random decay, not accident, a deliberate seam. He fetched his tools. A hammer, a chisel. His hands shook as he worked, each strike echoing too loudly in the narrow room. Plaster cracked, then stone. Dust fell in sheets, coating his hair, his lips. It tasted bitter, metallic, and then hollow. His chisel struck a pocket of air. He froze, heart pounding. He cleared the opening slowly, widening it until the shape became clear. A door, low, narrow, its edges sealed with mortar, now fractured by time. He dug at it until the last stone fell away. Dust poured out, thick as ash, and behind it, a stairway. The air that escaped was cold. Not fresh, but cold. It crawled across his skin like the breath of something long buried. Malcolm raised his lamp. The flame trembled. Steps led downward, worn smooth, steep. He hesitated only once. He thought of leaving, of sealing the wall, of saying nothing. But curiosity pressed harder than fear. He lifted the lamp. He placed one foot on the first stair and began to descend. Each step groaned under his weight. The air grew heavier, damp with stone dust. His lamp cast long shadows on walls too clean, too deliberate. This was no ruin, no forgotten passage of medieval masons. The walls were newer, straighter, their stones cut with precision. This was not accident. This was construction. But something wasn't right. As he moved deeper, the sound of the cathedral above faded. No creak of pews, no rattled windows, only the hollow rhythm of his boots against stone. He tried to measure the depth, counting steps under his breath. 20, 30, 40. The descent seemed endless. His lamp flickered. The flame bent sharply, as though pulled downward. He shielded it with his hand. His breathing quickened, and that's when he heard it. A faint shift. Not echo, not draft. A sound too deliberate. The scrape of stone, or the fall of dust. Somewhere ahead, somewhere waiting. Malcolm stopped. His chest tightened. He listened. Silence. But silence can betray. He swallowed hard, lifted the lamp higher. The stairwell opened at last into a landing. A narrow corridor stretched before him. Its walls bore no ornament, no carvings, no marks of worship. Only stone, newer stone. The ground crunched beneath his boots. Layers of dust, untouched for years, for centuries. He walked slowly, each step a violation. His lamp's glow trembled against walls that seemed to close, and the further he moved. He felt it in his stomach, the strange certainty that he was being guided, not wandering. The corridor ended at a wall, but no ordinary wall. Its stones were smoother, larger, fitted so precisely they seemed poured rather than laid. And in the center, faintly visible through dust, was a mark. A cross, not carved with care, not ornate, scratched, crooked, done quickly, almost desperately. He reached for it. His hand hovered just above the stone. The chill radiating from it raised the hairs along his arm. He withdrew his hand, and then he saw it, at the base of the wall, half buried in dust. Something faintly protruded, a seam, not unlike the one he had broken in the sacristy. A door. Malcolm's breath caught. His chest rose and fell too quickly. His hand tightened on the lamp. He wanted to flee, to forget, to return to the safety of the known. But curiosity, the same force that had driven him here, did not release him. He bent down, brushed away the dust. His fingers traced a faint outline. The stone was too clean, too new. This wall had been built not to support, but to seal. His knees weakened. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. What was sealed? What was meant never to be found? The silence pressed against him, thicker now, like a weight on his ears. His lamp guttered. His hand shook so violently wax dripped across his knuckles. He flinched, hissed, but still he held the light. And then, from the other side of the wall, a sound, barely audible, faint as breath. Not words, not chant, but the low, rhythmic pattern of something that could not be mistaken. Knocking. 1. Pause. 2. Pause. 3. Malcolm staggered back. The lamp shook. The flame flared and nearly died. His chest seized in panic. He turned. He ran. Back through the corridor. Up the stair. His lungs burned. Dust choked his throat. The lamp flickered wildly as he climbed. Each step in agony. His boots slammed the stone in frantic rhythm. At last, light. The seam in the wall. The sacristy. The safety of air not yet poisoned by silence. He burst through the opening, slammed the panel back into place, braced his body against it as though something pressed from the other side. But nothing came, only silence. He collapsed onto the floor, chest heaving, sweat soaking through his shirt. His lamp guttered and died, leaving only the faint glow of a single candle on the sacristy shelf. For hours he sat there, listening, waiting. No more knocking came, but he could not unhear it. 1, 2, 3. The next morning, the sacristy appeared unchanged. The walls sealed again, dust swept into corners. To anyone else, it was as if nothing had happened. But Malcolm carried the memory in his eyes. And in the days that followed, he spoke less. He slept poorly. He startled at every sound of settling stone. He never returned to the stair. But he knew, with a certainty that gnawed at him, that something waited there, and that it had heard him. The camera drifts downward through stone, from a vaulted arches above, into the dark that lies beneath. The sound fades until only the slow hush of breath remains. After Malcolm's descent, word spread in whispers. The caretaker had found something, a stair sealed for centuries, a wall that did not belong. He refused to speak of it clearly. his eyes shifting whenever the subject arose. But the silence around him only deepened suspicion, and curiosity is never content with silence. 2 weeks later, a group of clerics gathered in the sacristy. They brought lanterns, ropes, and records of the old foundation. They told themselves it was for inventory, for safety, for certainty. But beneath those words lay something more human. They wanted to see for themselves. The wall was broken again. Dust scattered across the floor like pale ash. The stair revealed itself as if it had been waiting. They descended slowly. The air grew close, thick with a taste of stone and old water. Their lanterns painted narrow halos against the walls. And with every step downward, the cathedral above seemed further away, as if they were sinking into a place that did not recognize it. At the bottom, the corridor stretched, narrow, silent. Their breaths echoed back at them, uneven. They walked in single file, their footsteps stirring clouds of dust that had not risen in centuries. And then, ahead, a door, tall, narrow, its stone surface smoother than the rest. They hesitated. No one wished to be the one to open it. Finally, one priest pushed. The hinges groaned like a wounded thing. The lantern light spilled into the chamber beyond. At first, they did not understand what they were seeing, because the room was familiar, too familiar. It was a chapel, a perfect reflection of the cathedral above. Its proportions matched. Its arches echoed the same lines. Its altar stood in the same place, but inverted, stripped of color, stripped of warmth. A mirror, but something wasn't right. The windows, instead of stained glass, were slabs of bare stone. The pews were narrow, skeletal, angled harshly toward the altar as though forcing posture instead of inviting prayer. The crucifix was not wood but iron, blackened and twisted, its figure faceless. And the altar was black. Soot clung to its surface. Charred residue stained its edges, as though fire had licked it endlessly, yet never consumed it. The air smelled faintly of ash, dry and sharp, though no flame had burned there in years. They stepped closer. Lantern light wavered. Shadows stretched wrong across the walls, bending in angles that didn't match their movements. One priest whispered that it was a mockery, that every object, every detail, had been copied deliberately, but altered. The chalice on the altar was not gold, but lead. The missal was bound not in leather, but in some rough hide, brittle with age. The candlesticks were unlit, but coated in wax that had dripped in unnatural spirals down their length. It was as if the Mass had been rehearsed here, reenacted, but distorted. And that's when he heard it. One of the younger clerics swore a sound rose from beneath the altar. Faint, a rasp, the scrape of something shifting against stone. He leaned closer, straining his ears, but no one else acknowledged it. Still, the unease spread. Their eyes returned again and again to the black altar, to the soot, to the faceless figure above it. One man crossed himself. Another whispered prayer under his breath, quick, hurried. But prayers did not feel welcome there, because this was not a place of worship. It was a place of rehearsal, a place of repetition, a place built not for God, but for something else. They stood in silence, unsure whether to leave or to study further. And in that silence, the room seemed to breathe around them. Their lanterns hissed faintly. The soot shimmered in the light, like fine ash falling slowly, endlessly, though no fire burned. One of them stepped forward. His hand brushed the chalice. It was heavy, too heavy for its size, and left a faint gray residue on his fingers. He dropped it quickly, his breath catching. Another opened the missal. Its pages cracked and flaked. The words inside were not prayers. They were broken phrases, half-familiar, twisted versions of liturgy, responses that did not answer, invocations that never ended. The book closed with a sharp snap. No one wanted to touch it again. They backed away from the altar, slowly, careful not to disturb the objects. Their lantern light trembled on the iron crucifix. For a moment, one swore he saw the faceless figure tilt, just slightly. But when he looked again, it was still. The silence deepened. The air pressed heavy. Each man felt it, the certainty that they were not alone, that this room had not been abandoned. It had been waiting, They turned back toward the corridor. No one spoke. No one breathed more than necessary. But as they passed through the narrow door, one priest looked back, and he swore the soot on the altar was no longer settled. He swore it was still falling, like ash from a fire that had never gone out. They sealed the stair again, tried to forget, told themselves it was a relic of old masons, a folly, a mistake. But each of them carried it with them. The sight of a chapel below the chapel, a mirror that mocked them, a black altar that did not belong. And in the weeks that followed, their prayers grew unsteady, their sermons shorter, their nights restless. Because once you see the shadow of your own sanctuary, you cannot pray the same way again. The camera lingers over a narrow desk, bathed in low light. Dust rises with the faintest breath of air, drifting like pale smoke above paper left untouched for decades. The ink has faded, but the hand that wrote it remains alive in its tremor. The journals were not cataloged. They were hidden, discovered in the false bottom of a trunk, their bindings frayed, their pages stained by time and handling. The handwriting was uneven, at times elegant, at others hurried, collapsing into smudges as though written in secret, under pressure in the dark. And though the entries belonged to different hands, they all circled one plea: do not let him finish the Massachusetts. At first glance, they read like fragments of confession, half-sentences, broken prayers, names without context, the kind of erratic writing that archivists often dismissed as the product of failing memory or unstable devotion. But here the words carried weight, because the women who wrote them had been bound by silence. Nuns of St. Mary's Convent, ordered, decades earlier, in vows more severe than any spoken rule. They were not to sing. They were not to speak. They were not even to whisper in prayer. Only their pens were permitted to move. And even then, only when commanded. The journals were their only voice. And when pieced together, those voices formed something terrifying. The first entries seemed harmless enough. A sister describing the toll of bells that rang at improper hours. Another remarking on the way shadows fell unnaturally across the nave when no candles burned. One mentioned the bishop's eyes, that they lingered on the altar too long, his lips moving without sound as if rehearsing something unspoken. But then the notes turned sharper, shorter, urgent. It is not Massachusetts. He is not praying. Do not let him finish. The repetition was striking, as if every sister, in her isolation, reached the same conclusion without consultation, without collusion. And yet they never said what finishing meant, only that it must be stopped. But something wasn't right. The deeper archivists read, the more they noticed how the handwriting shifted. Each journal belonged to a different woman, but the phrasing, word for word, became eerily consistent. Identical sentences reappeared across different volumes, in different hands, as though dictated by a single mind. The sisters had been separated. They were forbidden to speak, and yet their words aligned. It was not coincidence. One entry described a night when the sacristy door was open an hour long after Compline. The sisters watched, from cracks in their dormitory shutters, men descending with candles, their light vanishing beneath the cathedral. The bishop followed, carrying not the missal, but another book entirely, another road of music, subterranean, low, like a drone carried on stone, impossible to locate, impossible to silence. And always, the refrain returned. Do not let him finish the Massachusetts. The phrase was underlined, scratched so violently that the nib tore through the paper. And that's when he heard it. The caretaker, cataloging late into the night, lifted one of the journals to the lamplight. The ink shimmered strangely, as if still wet, and beneath the scratching of his pen across his own notes, he swore he heard another sound, an echo soft, like a chorus murmuring in unison, words he could not decipher. He closed the book. The sound stopped. He opened it again, and the air in the room felt heavier. The journals were not records in the ordinary sense. They were warnings, instructions passed in secrecy, coded in repetition. Each entry leaned toward one horizon, that something, buried beneath ritual, beneath tradition, had been set in motion. And yet, no entry described what would happen if it was allowed to reach its end. Suspicion became horror as archivists uncovered the final volume. Its last pages were blank, except for the last line, not in ink, but carved into the pulp of the paper, pressed with such force that it tore through. "He is close." The pages ended there. No date, no name, no explanation, only the impression of the pen. The caretaker did not sleep that night. He stacked the journals on his desk, one atop the other, afraid to leave them closed, afraid to leave them open. And as dawn broke, he realized something that chilled him deeper than any word within. Every journal began on the same date. Every journal ended on the same page. And every sister who wrote them disappeared from the records within the same week. The convent never acknowledged their absence. The bishop never mentioned their silence. And the mass, whatever it was, had never been stopped. The caretaker closed the final book, but his hand lingered, because in the quiet of that morning light, he thought he heard it again, a low murmur, beneath the stone, beneath the earth, as though someone was still speaking, still writing, still waiting. And for the first time, he understood what the sisters had feared. It was not the silence that frightened them. It was the thought of what might come after. The journals remained on his desk, but he could not bring himself to touch them again, because he realized something unbearable. The plea was not directed to the church, not to history, not even to God. It was directed to whoever would one day read them. To him, do not let him finish the Massachusetts. The reel was found at the back of a drawer, sealed in its tin, dust caked into every ridge of the lid. Its label was handwritten, barely legible. The ink bled into the yellowing tape that held it shut. The archivist turned it over in his hand, noting the date, March 12, 1961. There was no record of a service on that day, no liturgy scheduled, no choir listed. The church calendar, preserved in immaculate detail, had left that Sunday blank, but the tape existed, and curiosity became stronger than caution. He threaded it into the machine. The reels clicked, the tape pulled tight, and the software began to fill the small listening room. At first, only static, a low hiss, the faint crackle of dust on the tape's surface. Then a sound began to emerge, a single voice, deep, resonant, chanting. The language was familiar, the long vowels, the rhythm of Latin intonations, but something felt off. The syllables didn't resolve. The cadence stumbled against itself. It was Gregorian chant, but it was moving backwards. The archivist leaned closer. His breath caught against the grill of the speaker, because the recording wasn't just reverse sound. The voices were carrying the words that way, singing syllable by syllable, each note placed in deliberate reverse, as if learned and rehearsed that way from beginning. The chant grew louder. Other voices joined in one by one, a full choir, men's voices, women's voices, layered against the stone acoustics of the cathedral. The air seemed to tighten as the sound swelled, until the room felt smaller, closer, as though the walls themselves were bending inwards. But something wasn't right. The longer he listened, the more he realized the choir wasn't harmonizing. The notes collided, straining against each other. It was not music, not prayer. It was something closer to summoning, a repetition of sounds that press against the ear, uncomfortable, dissonant. And then, a pause. The tape fluttered, and without warning, the singing stopped. Not faded, not concluded, cut off, as if every mouth had snapped shut in the same instant. The silence was abrupt, unnatural, and that's when he heard it. A rush of air, gasps, voices rising, not in song but in panic, chairs scraping against stone, footsteps scattering. The clatter of a book dropped against the floor. Screams, raw, brief, and then gone. The tape ended there. The archivist froze, his hand resting on the stop button. He rewound the reel, played it again, listened to the chants, the swell of voices, the sudden cut. Each time, the same pattern. Each time, the silence felt like a blade. But what unnerved him most was not what was heard. It was what was missing. No service had been recorded for that day. No choir had been present. The parish archives made no mention of music, rehearsal, or even attendance in the cathedral. The pews, a according to records, had stood empty, and yet the tape proved otherwise. Suspicion grew. He took the reel to colleagues, asking if it could have been fabricated, manipulated. They shook their heads. The technology wasn't there in 1961. Not in this place. Not with this precision. The acoustics confirmed it. It was a cathedral. No question. The air, the stone, the resonance of the vaulted ceiling. It was unmistakable. But there was something else. When engineers analyzed the recording, mapping the sound, they noticed a detail the archivist had missed. The choir was too large. Dozens of voices. Far more than the convent had housed at the time. Far more than the small parish could have ever assembled. And the arrangement of the voices, plotted in the spectrum of the tape, revealed something chilling. They were standing in a circle, not facing the altar, but facing each other. Horror seeped in slowly, with the realization that the recording was never meant to be heard. It was not liturgy. It was not song. It was ritual, and it had been interrupted. The panic on the tape, the breaking off, the screams, suggested something went wrong. But no report had been filed, no deaths recorded, no mention anywhere of what had taken place inside the cathedral that day. Collapse came in the listening. Late one night, the archivist played the reel alone, headphones clamped tight over his ears. The chant began, its backwards rhythm crawling along his spine. He listened, waiting for the cut, for the panic. But this time, the tape did not stop. The reel turned on. The voices grew. The panic did not come. Instead, the chanting continued, long past the point it had ended before. The choir surged higher, denser, their words folding on themselves until they blurred into a single, continuous tone. And beneath it, he swore he heard his own breath, not outside the headphones, inside, as though another voice had joined the circle. He tore the reels free, the tape whipping across the desk. But the sound had already lodged itself in memory. And when he left the room, when he stepped into the dark hallway of the archives, he could still hear it. A chant, low, backwards, growing louder the further he walked. The tape was silent, but the choir had not ended. Not for him. The cathedral loomed against the evening sky, its spire a black silhouette pressed against fading light. The bells had long fallen silent, yet the square remained watched, as though the stone itself still listened. In daylight, the building seemed unchanged. Visitors lit candles. Parishioners knelt in pews. Tourists clicked photographs of stained glass. The facade carried the same serenity it had for centuries. But beneath the ground, questions had begun to stir. The chamber. Whispers spread to the town that something had been discovered under the nave, hidden behind locked iron doors deep in the cellar. The first mention came from a custodian, an older man, who admitted, in passing, that his duties had been restricted. He was no longer permitted below. The stairway to the basement was chained. He laughed it off, called it a renovation, but when pressed, his eyes darted away. And that's when people began to notice. Every evening, as dusk approached, guards appeared, men in dark suits, some with clerical collars, posted themselves at the side entrances of the cathedral. They did not greet parishioners. They did not answer questions. They simply stood, and when night fell, the doors were bolted from within. The denial came quickly. Local investigators filed requests, pressing the diocese for explanation. The reply was sharp, formal, and unyielding. There is no chamber. The records are mistaken. The cathedral's basement is a utility space, used only for storage. The tone was final, but something wasn't right. If there was nothing to hide, why post guards? Why seal the basement overnight? Why, as several neighbors swore, did cries echo up to the ground when the sun went down? At first, it was dismissed as gossip, wind moving through the old pipes, animals caught beneath the stone. But the stories grew darker. A woman living across the square claimed she heard prayers, chanted not in the measured rhythm of liturgy, but in broken fragments, gasped as though through pain. Another swore she heard a single voice calling for help, cut short in mid-breath. The faithful began to avoid the evening services. They lit their candles in daylight. They left before the bells tolled vespers. And still, the diocese denied it. One official, when pressed during an interview, forced a thin smile. His words were rehearsed, his tone brittle. "There is no chamber," he repeated. But his hand trembled as he folded the paper in front of him. Suspicion deepened when records were reviewed. Blueprints of cathedral, drawn at its founding, showed a substructure below the nave. A long hall, flanked by side rooms, sealed by thick walls of stone. The design was never mentioned again in later documents. It was erased. Investigators pressed harder, demanded entry. The diocese responded not with compliance, but with silence. Then, guard began carrying lanterns, not just standing watch, but patrolling the grounds, circling the outer walls as if fearing something might slip through. And that's when he heard it. A journalist, staking out the square late at night, swore he caught the sound clearly, not muffled, not imagined. A scream, drawn out, human. It came from beneath the cathedral floor. He froze, his pen clutched against the paper, his heart racing in the cold night air. The guards did not move. They did not look up, did not even acknowledge the sound, as though they had been expecting it, as though it was routine. When he reported the incident, his editor refused to publish. No corroboration, no second witness. Too dangerous to cross the church. But the story spread anyway, through whispers, through parishioners' private confessions, through those who lived close enough to hear what should not have been heard. By then, unease had tipped into horror. Children were warned not to linger near the cathedral after dusk. Candles, once left in prayer, now burned as wards. People began crossing themselves not as devotion, but as protection. The cathedral remained open. Mass continued. The bells rang. But the basement was sealed, always sealed, and no one who entered after nightfall was seen leaving before dawn. Collapse came quietly. The church's insistence, its repetition that there was no chamber, no secret, no voices, no longer reassured. It only deepened the fear, because the people had heard it themselves, and the denial felt less like protection, more like complicity. By the end of that winter, no one entered the cathedral willingly after sunset. Even the guards, posted in their stations, no longer met each other's eyes. They stood rigid, silent, waiting. And each night, as the bells fell quiet and the last of the light drained from the sky, the same sound returned, low, muffled, rising through the stone. Not chant, not prayer, but screams. And still the diocese denied. There is no chamber. There is no sound. There is nothing to fear. But behind their words, behind the bolted doors and guarded halls, one question remained unspoken. If nothing existed beneath the cathedral, why did they guard it every night? The square was empty that night. The cathedral stood alone in silence, its stone washed in the weak orange glow of a street lamp that flickered without rhythm. The doors were locked. The guards had left their posts. And in that gap of absence, a young man stepped forward. He wasn't a parishioner. He wasn't a believer. He was an explorer, an urban drifter, one of those who saw forgotten places, who crept into ruins and sealed halls not for prayer, but for proof. His name has been omitted in the records. His footage, however, has not. He carried a camera, a handheld device, its light weak, its lens cheap, the kind meant for wandering tunnels or basements. He recorded every step. At first, nothing was unusual. The camera showed empty pews, abandoned aisles, the stillness of cathedral after hours. His voice was low, nervous, but steady. He whispered that it slipped in through a side entrance left ajar, that no one had seen him. And then he turned toward the stairwell. The iron gate that sealed the basement had been forced open, its chain cut, its padlock discarded. The camera shook as he descended, his breath quickening in the narrow stone stair. There was no electricity below. The air was damp. Each step echoed, as though the basement were larger than it should have been. He whispered again, said he had reached the bottom, said he could see something in the dark. And that's when the light caught it. An altar, perfectly arranged. Candles stood in neat formation. Their flames burned steady, though there was no sign of a hand to light them. Chalices were placed in pairs, each filled, not with fresh wine, but with a thickened liquid, so dark it seemed almost black against the camera's beam. And behind it all, a table, set as if for mass. But no one was there. No priest, no parishioners. Only the setting, prepared, waiting. The explorer's breath grew uneven. His whisper faltered. He asked, softly, to no one, how any of this could exist. Because the chamber was not empty. It was ready, as though a service had been scheduled, as though the faithful had simply not yet arrived. But something wasn't right. The footage began to shake. He stepped closer, his lens focusing on the chalices. The liquid clung to the edges, slow, syrup-like. His voice broke. This isn't wine. The sound echoed against stone. Then another sound answered, low, drawn out, barely caught by the microphone. A voice, chanting. The camera spun. Nothing. Only the walls. Only the altar. The voice grew louder. Not sung with devotion. Not prayed with rhythm. But muttered, as if many voices were speaking at once. Broken, overlapping, tangled together into something that resembled worship but felt wrong. And that's when he heard it. Footsteps. Not his own. They came from deeper in the chamber. Heavy. Deliberate. The camera jolted again. The lens blurred as he turned, catching only stone, shadow, and a flicker of candlelight. He whispered he wasn't alone. And then the chanting stopped. Silence. So heavy, the microphone picked up the rush of his breathing. The explorer stepped backward, his shoes scraping against stone. His camera caught the altar once more. The chalices were no longer still. The liquid inside rippled, as though something beneath the surface had moved. He swore, the word barely audible. He whispered again that he needed to leave, but he didn't turn. He kept filming. And in the last clear seconds of the recording, something happened. The candles, each one, sputtered, not extinguished, not snuffed out, but flared one after the other in a chain, as if reacting to something unseen. The explorer cried out. The sound cracked. The footage lurched violently. And then it ended. 8 minutes. No more. No less. The file was recovered from his abandoned device, found days later on the steps outside the cathedral. The explorer himself was never seen again. The diocese denied his existence, denied the footage, denied the chamber. But the video remains. Passed in whispers, played in dark rooms, paused at frames where shadows don't move as they should. 8 minutes of proof. 8 minutes of silence after. 8 minutes that no one should have seen. And yet, one scene cannot be forgotten, because what he captured was not a ruin, not a relic. It was a mass that should not be. The shelves of the archive stood like stone pillars, tall, dust-lined, silent, the kind of silence that does not simply come from absence of sound, but from years of preservation. The diocesan archive was not a library in the usual sense. It was a vault, a place where records of births, deaths, transfers, ordinations, and resignations were meant to remain untouched. And yet, in 1994, something changed. A clerk on the third floor noticed first. She pulled a ledger marked St. Mary's Cathedral, Sacramento Records, 1912 to 1958. The spine cracked as she opened it, but the pages inside were blank. Not torn, not erased, blank. She carried it to her supervisor. He told her it was an error in binding, but she had handled that same ledger only 2 years before, and every page had been full. By the following week, 5 more volumes from the St. Mary's collection had emptied. Baptisms, confirmations, marriages, deaths, entire generations, gone. The microfilm reels were checked. They should have been backups. They should have been safe. But when the spools turned, the screen did not display names and dates. It displayed only gray static, punctuated by black streaks that resembled burn marks. The librarian who ran the machine leaned closer. She said the frames looked as though they had been scorched, but only on the inside of the film, as if the fire had come from within. She documented the reels in a report, filed it with her director, and waited for a reply. None came. Instead, the reels disappeared from the cabinet. When she returned the next morning, Every single box labeled St. Mary's was gone. She searched the inventory cards. Someone had replaced them with new slips of paper, each one written in the same mechanical hand. Each one stating simply, "Record not held." But something wasn't right. The handwriting. It was not clerical, not even consistent with the other cards. It was too deliberate, as if someone had traced each letter slowly, aware they were being watched. The librarian raised the issue in a meeting. She spoke calmly, carefully, describing what she had found. Her colleagues did not respond. No one asked questions. No one even looked at her. When she left the room, she realized something terrifying. Her own notes, the copies she had made by hand, were gone from her desk. And that's when she heard it, a faint click, the sound of her office door locking. From the outside, she tried the handle. It would not turn. She waited. Minutes passed. Then the sound came again. The door unlocked. When she opened it, the corridor was empty. That night, she typed her resignation. A single page. A single sentence. "I can no longer continue." The letter was left unsigned. Her keys were found on the desk. Her coat still on the chair. She never returned to the archive. Her resignation was processed without question, without signature. And the records tied to St. Mary's vanished altogether. No baptisms, no marriages, no funerals. As if an entire parish had been cut out of time. Researchers still search for fragments. In newspapers, in family journals, in the margins of unrelated files. But the diocesan archive has nothing left. Only absence, only silence. And in the silence, a question remains. Who destroyed the records? Or worse, why were they erased? The camera drifts slowly down a corridor. White walls, pale light, the kind of light that belongs to hospitals at night. Sterile, yet heavy. At the far end, a door stands half open. The bishop's room. It was the spring of 1963 when his final illness came. By then, the diocese had already begun to distance itself. He was spoken of politely, but rarely. His name was recorded only in official bulletins, never in conversation. Those who still visited described a man whose body had withered, but whose eyes refused to close. Even when the morphine dulled his speech, his gaze remained fixed on the ceiling, as if watching something others could not see. The attending nurse recalled it clearly. He would stir at night, whispering fragments of liturgy into the quiet, phrases broken by coughs, but insistent rhythmic, as if he were not praying, but repeating. When asked what troubled him, he answered in half-thoughts. Not here, not above, the mass below, the doors will not close. His confessor, an older priest, was called to the bedside. The nurse stepped out while the rites began, but even through the closed door, she heard the tone. It was not confession in the usual sense. It was pleading. Hours passed. The priest emerged pale, holding no papers, offering no words. But something wasn't right. The next day, the bishop demanded to write. He asked for ink, for a clean sheet of paper, and for the page to be sealed when he was finished. His hand shook violently. The letters cut uneven across the paper, but the words formed. They were not long, only a single sentence. The mass below has no end, it feeds upon ours. He folded the paper himself, pressed it into an envelope, ordered it closed with wax, and then he fell back into silence. The nurse later said she believed he had died in that moment, though his body lingered 2 more days. He spoke no further. His lips moved faintly, but no sound came. The envelope was carried to the chancery, marked confidential, placed in the diocesan archive under restricted seal. No copy was made, no discussion recorded. Years later, when researchers requested access, they found the envelope registered in the index, but when the drawer was opened, it was empty. The wax seal remained, unbroken, but the paper was gone. Some say the note was destroyed. Others claim it was moved to Rome. No explanation was ever given, and yet the words survived, whispered by those who had heard them in the hospital. repeated quietly, without attribution. The mass below has no end, it feeds upon ours. The sentence hung like an echo, never confirmed, never denied. What did he mean? Some believed he was speaking metaphorically, a dying man consumed by guilt, conflating memory with dream. But others remembered the chamber, the one beneath St. Mary's. The doors no one opened again. Was it a prison, or was it something else? If the bishop's words were true, then the mass below did not end. It continued, without congregation, without priest, without time, a ritual feeding on silence, on absence, on lives lived above, unaware. And the record, his final confession, was sealed. It was sealed, and then it was gone, which left only silence. But silence can be louder than words. Silence can hold weight. It can press against the walls of memory, filling the gaps with something heavier than sound. To this day, the archive lists the document as missing. To this day, the chamber remains locked. And to this day, the bishop's sentence is repeated in hushed voices, not because it explains, but because it refuses to. The mass below has no end. It feeds upon ours. And when the last witness is gone, the silence will be complete. Or worse, it will not. If faith is built on silence, what happens when silence prays back? Perhaps the bishop was not sealing a record, but a wound that never heals.